Welcome back to part 3 of this master copy of Juan de Pareja by Diego Velázquez, filmed entirely in real time. I apologise for how long it's taken me to finish this video, as it's been a while since part 2. But these real-time demos take me much longer to make, and as well as this video, I've also been working on videos for my Patreon channel, which just like this are all filmed in real time. So, in parts 1 and 2, I simplified Juan de Pareja into large masses based on the main light and dark tonal values, and I completed the essential features, the eyes and nose. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, I recommend you check them out before watching this. There's a link in the description below. There's also a link to the original reference image, in case any of you want to have a go at this exercise yourselves. Now that the eyes and nose have been established, you can see that I've already got the essence of Juan de Pareja's likeness. From here, I can now use the eyes and nose to accurately measure the rest of the features, the mouth and the outer contours of the face. If I'm happy with the way it's going, I will always feel a slight sense of relief when I get to this stage of a portrait, because I'll know for certain that I'm on the right track. Although there are still areas that could prove to be even more of a struggle, the hardest part of this painting is probably behind me. And of course, that doesn't mean there aren't still plenty of opportunities to mess this up. Here, I'm adding some very subtle reflected lights to the shadow on the left side of the head, to indicate the cheekbone and temple and add some variety to the shadow. It's really important whenever you add reflected lights not to over-exaggerate them. It's a really common mistake to make them too light. We make this mistake when we focus on a small area of our subject separately without comparing it to the whole. If we stare into the shadows, the variations in value will appear greater than they really are. If we exaggerate the changes in value and make the reflected lights too light, then our shadows will stop looking like shadows, and our image will lose its 3D appearance. So remember, as you add the more subtle variations in value, keep squinting and compare them to the other large value masses, seeing how they fit into the overall value scheme as a whole. And you'll find you only need to hint at a few of these subtle shifts for your image to appear lifelike. Here, I'm starting to work on the outer contours of the face. Because of the hairline, most of the edges around the face are quite soft, but even so there is still quite a lot of variety, with some places being much softer than others. Here I'm using some of my shadow colour to soften the edge of the eyelashes some more. As well as variety in the quality of the edges around the face, there's also quite a lot of variation in warm and cool colours. Here I'm placing some of my cool mid-tone along the outer edge above the cheekbone. And here, at the bottom of the cheek, I'm placing some of my warm mid-tone. This is one of the softer edges around the face, where the beard fades into the cheek. So here, I'm using a large soft-haired filbert brush to gently place some of my warm shadow colour. Here I'm adding a lighter note just above the left nostril. I'm now mixing more of my dark hair colour made with transparent oxide red and ultramarine, to which I'm adding a tiny drop of medium. I'm using this dark mixture to carve out the hard accent just above the right cheekbone. The only hard edge I can see around the whole of Juan de Pareja's face. The medium I'm using is a mixture made with stand oil, which is basically linseed oil which has been heated to thicken it, and rectified spirit of turpentine mixed in equal parts. Now, I generally don't use much medium when I paint. As much as possible, I try to use paint as it comes straight out of the tube. But I'm using medium here for the hair because I don't want the colour to sink in. As you build up layers of paint, the lower layers of paint, as they dry, will draw the oil out of the top layers of paint. This will cause the upper layers to dry with a dull matte finish. You may have noticed this yourselves if you've come back to a painting after it has dried and it's covered in areas that are dull and flat. And it's particularly noticeable in the darker areas, which are more reflective. By adding medium to my darks, I'm increasing their oil content, which means more oil will remain in the upper layers and my darks will retain their glossy appearance. This principle of building up the oil content in the upper layers of a painting is important, because if you end up with a greater amount of oil in the lower layers, it can cause problems like cracking. This is the fat over lean rule, making sure that the lower layers of paint closest to the canvas contain less oil than the top layers, making the top layers of paint fatter than the bottom layers. The fat over lean rule is the reason I tend to avoid mediums, certainly in the initial stages of a painting, and stick to just paint as it comes out of the tube. The only times I use medium in very small amounts is when I come back to a painting after it has dried, or in areas like this in the darks where I find sinking in to be a particular problem. For me personally, I find mediums to be a bit of a dark art, but there are many artists who use them all the time to great effect. There are also loads of different recipes, so if you decide to use a medium, make sure you do your research and find out what it does first. And don't just pick up a medium thinking it's some secret ingredient that will make you into a better painter. Learning to paint isn't about the type of medium you use, it's about learning the fundamentals, the natural laws of painting, proportion, values and colour. I'm now working on the hairline and the edges around the forehead. Because of the way the hair fades into the forehead, the edges here are all quite soft. Here I'm creating a soft edge by dragging some of my dark back into the light and going over it a couple of times so that they mix together. Here I'm adding some of my mid-tone in between the dark and the light. And here I'm adding some of my warm shadow in between the mid-tone and the hair to create an even more gradual transition. I'm now using my mid-tone to soften the edges around the eyebrows. And here I'm using some of my dark hair colour to add the dark accents to the eyebrows. The brush I'm using for this is one of my soft-haired Eclipse Coma brushes by Rosemary & Co. Here I'm lightening the left temple just a little bit more. But I'm being really careful not to overdo it. So I'm going to go over it again with some of my warm shadow. I'm now working on the hairline at the top of the forehead. Here I'm placing some of my midtone in between the forehead and the hair. Here I'm dragging the midtone across back into the hair. Notice how the marks made by the Eclipse Coma brush that I'm using look like strands of hair. This is a great way of creating the appearance of hair as it sweeps back away from the face. Here, there's a slightly harder edge where some of the hair falls across the face. You'll often see a variety of soft and hard edges along the hairline, with soft edges where the hair sweeps away from the face and harder edges where the hair hangs over the face. But in Juan de Pareja's case, most of his hair appears to be swept back away from the forehead. Here, I'm placing some of my midtone onto the top of the forehead, using the slightly darker value to create a subtle plane change as the top of the head turns back away from the front. Right, I'm now mixing more of my highlight colour, made with titanium white, transparent oxide red and ultramarine. Now I'm creating a warmer version of my highlight colour by adding some alizarin crimson to the mixture. Which I'm placing around the edges of the main highlight in order to further refine the shape of the forehead. Here I'm mixing a slightly cooler version of my original highlight colour, containing more white and ultramarine. And here I'm mixing a cool mid-tone colour, which I'm using to add a slightly cooler, lighter note that I see on the left side of the forehead. Here I'm adding a warmer note to the edge of the shadow on the left cheek. And now I'm mixing a really bright highlight colour made by adding even more titanium white to my highlight mixture. Which I'm using for the tiny highlights I scratched out earlier with the back of my brush on the brow, the bridge of the nose and the tip of the nose. So, with the highlights added, some more colour on the forehead and the hairline complete, I think I'm just about ready to start on the mouth and beard. Here, I'm using some of my dark hair colour to place the edge of his moustache. I'm next going to start scratching out the lighter areas around his mouth with the back of my brush. Starting with the small highlight just above the middle of the top lip. I see this highlight as lining up almost directly underneath the small highlight on the bridge of the nose. I'm now working across to the outer edge of the light shape on the right side of the upper lip, which I see as lining up directly underneath the outer edge of the right nostril. So you see how I can use the eyes and nose to measure and line up the mouth. Here, I'm scratching out the bottom lip. I'm now using some of my dark to place the left nostril. And here is a tiny little dark accent underneath the back of the nostril. Now, even though I've been able to line up the mouth horizontally, I can see that I've placed it too high and there isn't enough room between the nose and the upper lip. So I've had to rub it out ready for another attempt. This is the advantage of drawing things out with the back of your brush. It makes it much easier to correct your mistakes. Before going back to the mouth, I'm just adding a few lighter colour notes to soften the edges around the main highlight on the forehead. And here are some lighter notes on the cheeks. Here I'm making the light shape on the left cheek a little larger. Then softening its edge with some of my warm mid-tone. I'm now going back into the edge of the moustache. Here I'm softening its edge just under the right nostril with some of my cool mid-tone. I'm now adding the reflected light to the underside of the nose, making sure I keep it really subtle. And here I'm adjusting the left nostril, making it a little higher so that it lines up horizontally with the right nostril. I'm now redrawing the small highlight on the medial cleft, in the middle of the upper lip. I'm then working across to the outer edge of the upper lip on the right, after making sure it lines up directly under the side of the nose. Here I'm placing the small light shape underneath the corner of the mouth, which I see as lining up vertically with the highlight in the right eye. Once more, I'm scratching out the bottom lip. Here, I'm working across to the corner of the mouth on the left, which I see lines up underneath the left tear duct. Here, I'm starting to scratch out some of the other lighter shapes below the mouth, where the flesh shows through the beard. Here I'm making a warmer version of my dark hair colour made with ivory black and vermilion. Which I'm using for the moustache. Notice how this cooler dark brings out the warmer colour of my original shadow underneath. As I place this dark, I'm careful not to cover the warmer shadow underneath entirely, but leave it showing through in places, to give the appearance of the flesh showing through the hairs of the moustache. Here I'm adding a drop of medium to my dark to make it more transparent, so more of the warm colour underneath will show through. Here I'm painting the small highlight on the medial cleft in the middle of the upper lip. And now I'm adding some vermilion to my mid-tone to make it even warmer, which I'm going to use for the upper lip. This colour could also be a little lighter. Here I'm creating more of my upper lip colour, a much warmer orangey colour made with transparent oxide red, vermilion and some Naples yellow. So far in this painting, the colours I've been using have been fairly muted. You can see from my palette that I've essentially just got warmer and cooler versions of each of my main values. But here, around the mouth, the colour gets much stronger. We have these much warmer, more saturated reds and oranges. However, even though these colours are stronger and brighter, I'm still thinking about them in the same way I've been thinking about all the other colours so far, just by comparing their temperature. The thing to remember is that colour is relative. Colours appear the way they do because of the other colours around them. If I were to place this orange-brown mixture I'm using for the lips next to some pure vermilion, it would no longer appear as warm. It would look much cooler, and compared to the bright red, it will also appear greyer. The reason it appears warmer and more saturated in this painting is because of all the cooler greyer colours I'm using elsewhere. Here I'm using a cooler midtone for the small light shape under the corner of the mouth. Now, if I were to place some of this midtone next to my pure vermilion, the brighter red would make this greyer midtone appear even cooler. More blue or even green, closer to the complementary of red. So the same colour can appear completely different depending on the other colours around it. This principle that colours are relative to each other is for me the most important thing you need to know about mixing colour. Because what it means is that you don't have to match colours exactly. By that I mean looking at each colour separately and asking yourself, what colour is it? Instead, you have to try and match their relationships. So whenever you mix a new colour, the questions you need to ask yourself are, is it warmer or cooler, lighter or darker, and more saturated or greyer than my other colours? For me, learning to think of colours in terms of their relationships with each other resulted in a massive breakthrough in my use of colour. If you want to learn more about it, I recommend you watch my video on colour temperature. I'll put a link in the description below. Right, here I'm mixing an even warmer colour made with vermilion, transparent oxide red and alizarin crimson. Which I'm using for the underside of the bottom lip. Here I'm placing some of this warmer colour in between the lips in the middle of the mouth. Which I need to make a little darker. Here I'm adding some warmer notes to the flesh under the mouth as it shows through the beard. Here I'm mixing a warmer, lighter colour. Which I'm using for the top plane of the bottom lip, which is catching the light. I'm now using the back of my brush to scratch out the small highlight on the bottom lip. Here I'm making the bottom lip a little larger. And here I'm using a soft-head filbert brush to soften the edge of the bottom lip. Whenever you paint someone's mouth, you will find most of its edges will be soft. You will usually only see 1 or 2 hard accents around the edges of the lips. In this case, there's a hard edge just under the small highlight above the middle of the upper lip. You will also see a few dark accents in between the lips, usually around the corners of the mouth and one in the middle. A mistake you will see beginners make is to draw a continuous line in between the lips from one side to the other. They will also leave too many lines around the outsides of the lips. This is something you must try hard to avoid. Too many hard edges around the mouth will definitely make it look graphical, like an illustration. For your mouth to appear realistic, you want to keep the hard accents to an absolute minimum. And even then, the dark accents in between the lips will often have soft edges, particularly around the corners of the mouth. In this case, the corners of Juan de Pareja's mouth are completely lost into the beard. Many portrait painters consider the mouth to be the hardest part of a portrait. Probably because with a live sitter it's always moving. For me, I actually find getting the eyes to line up with each other to be the hardest part, but getting the mouth exactly right can definitely be very challenging. Because the mouth, more so than the eyes, can often be the key to capturing your sitter's expression. The slightest adjustment to the corners of the mouth can change your sitter's expression entirely. Take, for example, my painting. I don't know how I've done it, but doesn't my version look a little bit more like he's smiling? Right, here I'm using what is almost pure vermilion to place a really warm reflected light to the underside of the upper lip. The brush I'm using is a small round sable brush called a rigger. Here, I'm just softening the outer edge of the reflected light as it blends into the moustache. I'm now placing a dark accent in between the lips. I think I've made the dark accent too wide, so here I'm readjusting the reflected light with the back of my brush. And here I'm redrawing the dark accent. I'm now starting to work on some of the edges in between the beard and the area underneath the mouth. Here I'm placing a mid-tone in between the light shape under the corner of the mouth and the beard to soften its edge. Here I'm adding a warmer note that I see of almost pure vermilion to the bottom lip. I'm now going back into the area under the corner of the mouth, adding a slightly lighter note. And here I'm adding a lighter note to the bottom lip. Here I'm making the highlight on the medial cleft just above the middle of the upper lip a little lighter. And here I'm redefining the edge of the upper lip next to it. Here I'm adding a few more lighter notes to the area under the corner of the mouth. And here I'm using some of my warm lighter colour to add a small plane to the side of the bottom lip to make it look rounder. Finally, I'm having another go at the warm reflected light on the underside of the upper lip. placing it with a touch of pure vermilion. So, with those last few touches, I think I'm just about finished with the mouth. And I'm ready to start work on the beard. Here, I'm using some of my warm mid-tone to indicate a few places where the flesh shows through the beard. Here, I'm just softening the dark accent in the middle of the mouth. And here I'm adding a tiny reflected light right next to the left nostril with a touch of my pure vermilion. I'm now mixing more of my dark hair colour made with ultramarine and transparent oxide red, which I'm using to place the black hair under the bottom lip. Here I'm using some of my warm shadow colour to soften some of the edges around the black hair. And here I'm placing a cooler, lighter note that I see to the flesh just under the bottom lip. Here I'm indicating the outer edges of the beard. I'm now adding a bit more medium to some of my dark hair colour. And I'm starting work on the beard. I was tempted, now that the mouth has been finished, and we've been going for almost an hour to end part 3 here. But then, much as I would have liked to get part 3 out sooner, part 4 would have been me basically just painting the hair and background. So I decided to just carry on and finish the rest of this painting in this video. Here, I'm massing in the beard in much the same way as I did the moustache earlier, leaving areas where the shadow colour underneath is visible, so it looks like the flesh showing through the hairs of his beard. And now that the beard has been added, do you see how much warmer and more fleshy it makes the shadow side of his left cheek appear? Here, I'm adding a lighter note to the flesh under his mouth. And here are a few more warmer notes. Here, I'm using a larger, soft-haired Eclipse Coma brush and some of my warm shadow colour to soften the edges around his moustache and beard. Here I'm adding the sideburn on his left cheek, using some of my dark hair colour mixed with medium to make it more transparent. Because they're really close in value with each other, all the edges between the hair and the shadow on the left side of his face are really soft. Here I'm mixing more of my dark hair colour made with transparent oxide red and ultramarine, which I'm using for the area under his beard where the hair merges into his neck. Right, here I'm starting work on the area of light at the front of the neck, just under the beard, massing it in with some of my warm mid-tone. The front of the neck lines up directly underneath the small highlight just above the middle of the upper lip. Here I'm using my soft-haired filbert brush and the warm shadow colour to soften the edge of the beard as it merges into the front of the neck. Here is a much warmer note that I see along the edge of the beard. And now I'm placing the edge of the collar, which I see as really dark. Here I'm adding a darker, cooler version of my shadow colour to the flesh as it gets nearer the collar. And here I'm mixing a warmer version of my dark hair colour made by adding vermilion to it, which I'm placing next to the edge of the collar. I'm also using it to indicate the back of the neck. Here I'm using my palette knife to scrape back the back of the neck and soften its edge. And here I'm using the back of my brush to indicate the bottom of his ear. Now that I've placed his ear, I can see that the back of his neck needs to be a little wider. Here I'm indicating the bottom of his hair. And here is the back of his collar. Here I'm softening the edge at the back of the neck with my soft-haired Eclipse comber. Next, I'm painting back across the back of the neck with some of my shadow colour and a soft-haired filbert brush to soften this edge even further. I'm now readjusting the bottom of the ear slightly, making it a little lower. Right, I'm now moving back to the front of the neck. Here, I'm adding a touch of almost pure vermilion to the small warm note that I see along the edge of the shadow under the beard. Here, I'm adding the small dark accent to the collar, right at the front of the neck. I'm now adding a lighter note to the flesh right next to this small dark accent. Placing it with some of my highlight colour. Here, I'm using some of my vermilion mixture to indicate the small light shape at the bottom of the earlobe, which I see as really warm. The bottom of the ear lines up horizontally with the small highlight just above the middle of the upper lip. So after rechecking its alignment, I've decided that the earlobe needs to be a little lower. So here I'm readjusting it by painting over it with some of my dark. And then reapplying the warm vermilion. With the ear added and the neck and beard finished, I'm now ready to work on the hair. Here I'm indicating the outline of the hair, trying to place the shape of the hair mass more accurately. So here I'm mixing more of my medium into the dark hair colour to make it more transparent. And I'm going to use this transparent mixture to mass in the hair. This technique of applying transparent layers of colour is referred to as glazing. As someone who predominantly works alla prima, I do not use glazing very often. But here, by applying a transparent layer of colour, which also allows the colour underneath to show through, do you see how it gives the hair more depth? There are certain effects that can only be achieved with glazing. You can mix colours optically. For instance, you can create violet by painting a transparent layer of blue and a transparent layer of red over a white underpainting. Because the red and blue pigments are being used separately in their pure forms, this will give the violet a more vibrant appearance than if it had been created by mixing red, blue and white together. Also, each transparent layer will refract the light before reflecting it back off the paint underneath, giving the colours a more luminous appearance. The technique of glazing is as old as oil painting itself, and it was how the old masters were able to achieve the brilliance and luminosity we see in their colours. Renaissance artists like Titian would have used anything up to 30 or 40 different glazes in one painting. And artists of the Baroque period, like Velázquez, would have predominantly worked using glazing. In fact, painting with transparent glazes was the main method artists used right up until the 19th century and the advent of Impressionism. Here I'm adding a bit more pigment to make my glaze a little darker. The disadvantage of glazing is that it's slow. You need to wait for each layer to dry before painting over it, particularly if you're glazing over an opaque lighter colour, as it will mix into the layers above it. But here, because the hair underneath is also a transparent dark and has just been rubbed in thinly, I've managed to get away with it. I'm now mixing a colour for the background, made with ivory black, titanium white and Naples yellow. I'm going to start by mixing the lightest part of the background in the bottom right hand side of the painting next to his collar. There's a gradation moving across the background from the bottom right where it's lightest to the top left where it's darkest. Whenever you have a plain background like a wall behind someone, there will always be some subtle gradation as it moves closer to or away from the light source. It's really important when you paint the background to recreate this effect of the light moving behind them, because it gives the impression of the space in between your sitter and the wall. Here I'm mixing a darker version of my background colour. If you paint the background the same all the way around your sitter, it will make the background look as though it's coming right up to them, as though their head was sticking through a hole in the wall, rather than the wall being behind them. Another mistake is when you're painting someone with a light background to make the background too light. We make this mistake when we look at the background independently of the sitter. We see a white wall and we try to match the colour of the wall. Instead, when you paint the background, you should actually be looking at your sitter. They are the subject of your painting after all. And you'll see that out of the corner of your eye, the background appears much darker. So when you paint the background, don't stare at the wall behind, but paint the colour that you see in your peripheral vision while you're looking at your sitter. Now, speaking of making the background too light, I appear to have made my background a lot lighter and colder than the background in the painting. Part of the reason is the exposure settings on my camera, which have made all the colours appear lighter than they really are. Also, my background is lighter because I'm using titanium white, which is colder and more opaque than the lead white Velázquez would have used. Here, I'm mixing a darker version of my background colour. Which I'm using in the top left-hand corner. Another reason I've gone too light in the background is probably because I started off working from light to dark. If I'd gone the other way round, working from dark to light, it would have given me more control and I would have been able to lighten the background more gradually, making the gradation more subtle. But it's not the end of the world. My lighter background doesn't look too bad, so for the purposes of this demo, I think I can live with it. Here, I'm just wiping back the background a little with some paper towel to even out some of the brush marks. And next, I'm going to start working on the edges around the hair, which in most places are very soft. Here, I'm using one of my large softer head brushes to paint some of the background back into the hair. I'm now placing the back of the collar because I want to start working on the small area of background just behind it, the area in between the collar and the bottom of his hair. Because the back of the collar is in shadow, I'm using the same dark I used for the hair. Right, so now I'm starting to work on the area of background just behind the collar. As the back of the collar moves away from the neck, I see that its edge gets softer. So here I'm painting some of my background colour back across into the edge of the collar. Now here I'm mixing a lighter version of my background colour. Because I see just here at the bottom of the hair, the background becomes slightly lighter. We have just a hint of the gradation that moves from the bottom right to the top left. And although most of the edges around the hair are soft, this slightly lighter area creates a few harder accents. Here, I'm using my palette knife to scrape back and soften some of the other edges around the hair. And here, I'm applying a colour that's a middle value in between the background and the hair. Do you see how this gives the edges around the hair a see-through quality, creating the impression of the background showing through the hair? The brush I'm using to apply this edge colour is one of my softer brushes, a medium-sized Eclipse Coma by Rosemary & Co. Here I'm adding a few drops of medium, which will make the colour I'm using for the edges around the hair even more transparent. And now that I've added these soft see-through edges, do you see how it's really starting to look like hair? I think it's really interesting how Velázquez has painted the hair as a unified dark mass without needing to add any highlights or details, and yet it looks incredibly realistic. This is a great example of how little information is often needed in order to make something appear lifelike. So bear that in mind for when you next have to work on someone's hair and you start painting every single strand that you see. Here I'm adding one or two slightly harder accents to the hair on the right side of the head, just to create a little variety. But I don't want to overdo them, so here I'm painting back over one of them with my dark. It may take several attempts, but I'll keep going back and forward across an edge until I get the exact quality I'm after. And I think that will do, just a slight hint of an accent. So, now that I've added some interesting edge variety and I've finished shaping his hair, I think I'm just about ready to move on to the final part of this painting and do some work on the collar. Here I'm using my palette knife to create a hard accent at the back of the collar, just below the bottom of the hair. Here I'm mixing more of my lighter background colour, to which I'm adding some more yellow ochre and Naples yellow to make it slightly greener. I'm using this lighter colour to lighten the bottom right of the painting some more and make the gradation a little more pronounced. Here I'm mixing another cool grey colour that's quite similar to the background, which I'm using for the shadows on the collar. Here I'm making this shadow colour a little lighter. In the original painting, the white collar with its jagged edge is a really important part of the composition, contrasting effectively with the black of Juan de Pareja's hair and beard and his copper-coloured flesh. But for this demo, because I've chosen to focus on his head, I haven't left enough room for the collar. I also didn't want to spend too much time at the end of this demo working on it, so I decided to leave most of it out. But that being said, I still don't want the parts of the collar that remain to appear unfinished. Here I'm mixing a lighter, cooler colour for the collar, containing more blue. Which I'm going to use to mass in the lighter parts of the collar. Next, I'm mixing an even lighter colour for the highlights. However, now that the collar has been massed in, I've decided I quite like having the canvas showing through, as the weave of the canvas gives the collar the appearance of fabric. So here, I'm wiping back the collar with some paper towel dipped in solvent to bring back the canvas underneath. I often find it hard to know when to stop once I get to these finishing stages of a painting. To know exactly how much information is enough in areas like this that aren't the main centre of interest. This would be a good place to stop and come back to the painting at a later date. Sometimes you need a break before you can decide how much needs to be done before it's finished. But because this is a demo, I just need to press on. Here, I'm placing the shadow on the inside of the collar. Here, I'm using a soft-haired filbert brush to soften the edge of the shadow at the back of the collar, placing a mid-tone in between the shadow and the light. And here, I'm placing a small shadow shape that I see at the front of the collar. Next, I'm placing a few of the highlights. And here, I'm adding a transition to the edge of the collar close to the back of the neck to soften its edge. But I think my highlight colour looks a bit too cold, so here I'm wiping back the highlights with some paper towel. Here, I'm reworking the edge of the shadow at the back of the collar. Scraping it back with my palette knife to soften it. Here, I'm reapplying the small shadow shape at the front of the neck. And here's the small dark accent just in front of the neck. Finally, I'm going to place the shadow under the front of the collar. And with these last few touches, I think I've almost reached the end of this demo. The first demo I've done for this channel filmed entirely in real time, which in 3 parts totals around 3.5 hours in all. I'm aware it's taken me a while to get this finished, so thank you for bearing with me. It had been my intention to paint this live and record the commentary at the same time as I did the painting. But I find it quite hard to talk and paint at the same time. I get distracted and end up talking about stuff that isn't particularly relevant, and I miss out important information. So I decided to record the commentary after I'd finished the painting. That way I could make sure I included all the information I wanted to, and that I'd have enough time to try and explain things in a way that was clear and easy to understand. And we've covered a lot of ground in this demo. I've spoken about many different aspects of painting: drawing, values, edges and colour, so I hope my explanations have all made sense. I chose to do a master copy for my first real-time demo rather than work from a live model, because it means you can follow along. You can use the same reference image, which you will find in the description below, and you can watch these videos while you do the exercise yourselves. Master copies are a really valuable exercise. Every great painter in the past has done them, and so should you. They will give you a really useful insight into the methods and thought processes of the world's greatest painters, like Diego Velázquez. Even if you don't try to replicate their technique exactly. I didn't work the way Velázquez would have worked when I did this copy. Instead, I used more of a direct a la prima approach, and although it's far inferior to the original, I have still learned a lot. The main thing I'll be taking away from this is Velázquez's economy, both in how little information he needed, like we saw with the hair, and how few colours he used to produce such truthful and realistic portraits. Here I'm just adding a few last finishing touches to the eyes. Scratching out the small highlight in the white of the left eye with the back of my brush. And finally placing a dark accent in the left tear duct. So there it is, my finished copy of a portrait of Juan de Pareja by Diego Velázquez. One of my all-time favourite paintings, and the first demonstration I've done for this channel filmed entirely in real time. I really hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. If you'd like to see more demos like this one filmed in real time, remember to check out my Patreon channel. But in general, for this channel I prefer to keep the videos shorter and to the point, focusing on one topic at a time in more depth. Which hopefully means you won't have to wait so long before the next one. So until then, take good care of yourselves and good luck with your painting. And remember to tag me on Instagram if you're going to have a go at this exercise so I can see how you got on. Thank you for watching.